You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 26th of August, 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Israel once again convulsed by protests demanding an end to the war in Gaza. Germany rules out recognition of Palestine, and an overdue, if under severe, blow struck against public transport audio pests. I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. My guests Julie Norman and Yossi Mekelberg will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from Edward Luce about his epic new biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski, former National Security Advisor to US President Jimmy Carter and liberal Cold War hawk. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I am joined today by Julie Norman, Senior Associate Fellow on the Middle East at RUSI, and by Yossi Mekelberg, Senior Consulting Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Julie, as we will doubtless be reminding our listeners with increasingly wearisome frequency between now and October, you have a book coming out, but it is also actually quite germane to much of this evening's discussion.
It is. I have a book coming out in October called Gaza, the Dream and the Nightmare. It's a very accessible introduction to Gaza to really understand what's going on now. I did a bunch of interviews with Gazans last year as well as with Israelis, and it will be published October 24th, and we're doing a launch event in October as well. So all that's up online if you're interested. Okay,
well, we will doubtless be talking more about that as launch date nears. Yossi, we were discussing earlier just outside that it is exactly 20 years since either of us were last in Gaza. We must have missed each other by a matter of months.
Apparently so. And it's so fitting to the title of Julie's book, because this was the dream. Back in, we're sitting there, I was during the disengagement itself. We enter part of the press corps in Gaza, assigned to Shirat Hayam, and then we are sitting there in a cafe, and there's this Palestinian guy says, I have a brother in Saudi Arabia, and we are going to invest a Midland hotel on the beach, beautiful. And all the idea, not the kind of the Trump idea of building but one for Palestinians to create the vibrant economy, and this was the dream. And here we are now, 20 years later, living they living more than us, the nightmare.
Well, we will start in Israel, where decent-sized crowds look to have responded to calls for a day of protest by families of the remaining hostages held in Gaza by Hamas since October 7th, 2023. There are believed to be 20 still alive. Today is also, and/or was, supposed to be the day that Israel responded to a ceasefire proposal agreed by Hamas a week or so ago, though as we go to air, nothing has been heard from Jerusalem. However, US President Donald Trump has claimed that the war in Gaza will be concluded within his favourite timescale of 2 to 3 weeks. A frequently deployed deflecting device of his, but let any author who has never said the same to their publisher cast the first stone. Yossi, first of all, are these protests registering with Netanyahu? Lord knows nothing else has.
It's hard to tell, but we saw that in the past it did. When he fired the defense minister, Yoav Gallant. I think about this kind of protest, if these tens of thousands of people that right now as we speak gather in what became known as the Hostages Square by the Tel Aviv Museum, if they stay there for days no end until there is a change, I think there is a good chance. But a lot has to go what Washington says, what President Trump. I don't buy the 2-3 weeks, because we're supposed to have peace in Ukraine within 24 hours. So I think we have to take it with a pinch of salt. I think as long as it gathers momentum, Netanyahu plays a game, when should I call election? Between now and October 26. So when it's all of a sudden, when he wants to complete it, he's the master of U-turns. The minute it will be convenient for him to call election, then you'll see a deal, election, and then the current partner not important anymore. In many ways, this kind of protest will help him to decide when and how.
Is this the reason, Julie, that Israel seems, again, as of this broadcast, disinclined to take this deal? They are holding out. The deal, to recap, involves a 60-day ceasefire, the return of half the remaining hostages in exchange for the release of a yet-to-be-determined number of Palestinian prisoners. But is the reason that Israel's professed reason, I'll start by saying, is that they want all the hostages back, which is obviously not an unreasonable ambition. But are they saying that knowing that's unacceptable? Does Israel want this deal to work? And if the answer is no, why don't they?
Yeah, so I would say Israel's conditions for the deal have extended beyond just getting all the hostages back. And it should be noted that Hamas has said for months now that they would release all the hostages in exchange for a full end to the war. But Israel's also calling for Hamas to completely disarm, for the demilitarization of Gaza, for security control over Gaza, and not only no Hamas, but no Palestinian Authority governance in Gaza after the ceasefire as well. So these are conditions that Israel knows that Hamas cannot and will not agree to. And knowing that, I think, puts any kind of progress, whether it's a phase deal or a complete deal, very much in question, and instead allows the operation in Gaza City to move forward.
Also reports out of Israel, Yossi, that the Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff, General Eyal Zamir, is urging the Israeli government to take this deal. Does that sound plausible to you? And if the answer to that is yes, does this suggest that the IDF is not terrifically enthused about Netanyahu's ideas for occupying Gaza City, or what is still left of it?
Yeah, Lieutenant General Zamir was very clear, even during the meeting, the cabinet meeting 2 weeks ago, decision that the cabinet decided to extend the occupation or the campaign, military campaign in Gaza. He was dead against it. He said, we won't get the hostages like this. We put the hostages at risk, let alone if you're commander of a military, sending your troops after 22 months of fighting, that people served up to 350 days in reserve. The fatigue, so many injured, post-traumatic stress, all of this, and then you want to send them when there are a million people, guerrilla warfare, tunnels. This is a nightmare for any military commander. It doesn't mean. And then there is always the balance. If you want to reduce casualties among civilians in Gaza, it means you increase casualties among your soldiers. If you do the opposite, and meaning using heavy artillery and air force, it means that Israel's reputation internationally, which is not great right now, will get even worse because there will be many, many thousands of civilians there. And that's where the army is not interested, especially the question that they ask themselves, for what military gain? That will actually enter into never-ending occupation, which, by the way, also from an economic point of view, is estimated of costing around 20 billion shekels a year.
Do we detect, though, Julie, and going back to what Yossi was saying about the targeting of, or the striking of civilian targets, which has happened many, many times over the last nearly 2 years in Gaza, do we detect a significant shift in international reaction to them? If we think yesterday about the strike on Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, which was fairly transparently what is rather grimly known as a double tap, i.e. you bomb the target, you wait for the first responders to arrive, and journalists in this instance, and then you bomb it again. And the same countries which were kind of, I guess, trying to find excuses for Israel early on, most of them seem to have stopped doing that.
Yeah, I think we are seeing a turn, and it's been from several, I think, key events over the last several months. First, the killing of the aid workers back in the spring. Secondly, all the images and now confirmed reports of starvation and famine in Gaza. And then most recently, the targeting of journalists, and then the double knock strike yesterday, or the double tap strike yesterday that hit both journalists and rescue workers. And so you're at this moment now where even those who were giving Israel a lot of the benefit of the doubt just aren't believing that these things were mistakes anymore. anymore when there's been very clear targeting now in the past. And I do think it's changed the language. I will say it's still mostly in the diplomatic sphere, in rhetorical condemnation, these kinds of things. And I think European states in particular are struggling with what other levers to pull to kind of pressure Israel in a kind of meaningful way.
Is it significant, Yossi, that in the last nearly 2 years now, when things like this have happened, and they have happened a lot, the response from Israeli officialdom has tended towards, well, it's war's horrible, but they started it. Whereas yesterday Netanyahu did attempt, or did feel obliged to attempt, some sort of near apology. He said it was a tragic mishap. Now, we can believe that or not believe it, but is it significant that Netanyahu felt he had to try to style it out as such?
I think time will tell if now there is a change of approach to, because only 2 weeks ago they targeted Nasser Sharif, who is Al Jazeera journalist, claiming without substantiating it that he was a Hamas. They used the term terrorist. And when they were asked for evidence, they couldn't bring beyond something very flimsy. If this is a change now, and even if you give the benefit of the doubt that this was a mistake yesterday and Netanyahu apologized, the question if they learned from this mistake. At the end of the day, they bombed an hospital. It's not for the first time. So if you bomb an hospital, there is a chance that you'll kill civilians, you'll kill patients, kill medical staff. And the case of journalists, 200 media people have been killed in this war in Gaza. Many media networks are not allowed, most media networks are not allowed to enter Gaza. Not that there is shortage of evidence what's happening there, but the very fact that Israel doesn't want journalists there, and then 200 have been killed, tells us something.
Well, let's stay broadly in the vicinity, because German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has confirmed that his country will not be joining the recent rush of Western countries attempting to make a point to Israel by either recognising Palestine or threatening to. France, Canada, Australia and the United Kingdom are among those who have recently boarded the bandwagon, but speaking today at a joint press conference with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney in Berlin, Merz said that Germany's position will not change, as he does not see that the requirements for recognition, whatever they may be, have been met. Julie, is this Germany's attitude to Israel? And actually, we kind of know the answer to this is yes, because Merz went on to talk about it. This is Germany's contemporary attitude to Israel, very much being dictated by history, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is not a surprising position from Germany. The obvious history of the Holocaust has led to a very close relationship between Germany being very supportive of Israel historically, not only diplomatically, but also in terms of arms exports. So after the U.S., Germany is the largest exporter to Israel and certainly the strongest ally in Europe. I would say, though, while Germany wasn't really expected to make this move, I think it is notable that they have announced they will be ceasing arms exports to Israel that could be used in Gaza. So while they're not doing the recognition move, they are signaling to Israel and saying quite forcefully in other ways that they don't approve of what's happening in Gaza. And that's been increasing over the last several weeks.
Nevertheless, Yossi, opinion polling suggests that there is a slight but reasonable majority of Germans in favour of recognising Palestine. Wouldn't that be a fairly easy win for someone in Merz's position who is struggling for domestic traction?
I think Israel doesn't accept it, but we need to accept there is a new generation in Germany. They don't carry the guilt that the generation of their parents or grandparents had. And they see now the Palestinians the victims, because Israel is the strong side and is the one that's committing war crimes in Gaza. So yes, there is a shift. And I think generally, not only in Germany, I think generally in most countries right now, it's an easy way to appeal to the voters. But this is not the reason to recognize a Palestinian state. I think it's in the interest of Israel, this recognition. And I think I don't think it's secret in this studio that I supported this recognition way before the war, because this can change the relations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It will put them on equal footings in the negotiation. It will stop recognition Palestinian state to the sort of a carrot dangling over the heads of Palestinians all the time. If you'll behave yourself, you make all the concession that we demand from you, then you'll get in. Then when they accept it, then we put some more demands that you can't accept, and you still won't have a state. And it goes back from 1937. Every time that made any inquiry about what to do with this place, from the Peel Commission 1937, through the Partition Plan 1948, Madrid, Oslo, anyway, they reached the same conclusion, partition and two-state solution. So there is a UN resolution from 1947 of two states. You just actually reaffirm by recognizing Palestinian state what the international community says for a very long time.
Well, yeah, on which thought, Julie, it is worth recalling that most of the United Nations does recognise Palestine, and most of the United Nations has for quite some while. It is only Israel's more traditional allies who have held out. But that being the case, does it actually make any difference to anything if Australia, Canada, France, the United Kingdom all say, sure, fine, we will recognise or have recognised Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the states making this decision now are very clear-eyed about the fact that it's not going to change things on the ground immediately. It's not going to end the war in Gaza. It's not going to, suddenly stop the settlement expansion and whatnot in the West Bank. But what it does do, as Yossi said, is first it does allow for some sense of, I would say, a moral and diplomatic commitment to a Palestinian state in the future. It's making commitment to that two-state model that Israel had also been at least rhetorically committed to until this current government, and essentially saying not only in spite of it, really because of the current situation on the ground, this move needs to be taken just to keep that long-term option on the table. And I do think it provides a foundation for these states then to push back more aggressively at settlements, at settlement products, at settlement expansion, as not to mention everything going on in Gaza, because you're actually saying this is encroachment into another state that we recognize. And it provides a bit stronger foundation for making some of the policy moves that some of these states have been reluctant to take.
And let's remember, there are right now 3 G7 countries among these, the UK, France and Canada, 2 permanent members of the Security Council.
4, actually, with China and Russia.
Yeah, I mean, additional 2.
Yeah.
Additional 2 and 4, it means that the United States. So all what you need is one vote in the Security Council, but probably not going to happen. That will change, and there is a recognition Palestinian state in the Security Council. So there is a consensus in the international community. The question is how to translate it into the negotiation, into a two-state solution, and what kind of two-state solution. But right now we are not there.
Just to follow that up, and just finally on this one, Yossi, the line you were taking earlier, the idea that a two-state solution is good for Israel, that it ensures Israel's security, it's an argument that's been made for a while, I think most forcefully by Ami Ayalon, the former Shin Bet director, who I had this conversation with on an episode of the Foreign Desk many years ago. But Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar has said this week that accepting Palestinian recognition spelled, as he put it, suicide for Israel. Is that perhaps somewhat hyperbolic?
Humbly, I will rather listen to Ami Ayalon than Gideon Sa'ar, because Gideon Sa'ar knows he needs this kind of flip-flop when it comes politically. Only a year ago, he was dead against Netanyahu just to crawl into his government. So I won't take Gideon Sa'ar, opinion for anything. But in all seriousness, we saw what happens when you continue you don't need to, God forbid, justify October 7. We all think it was a terrible massacre. But we need to look what conditions create resistance that some people will translate it in the most horrific way. So part of it is reducing motivation, creating a country, a state next to you that is friendly, and as you need to create hope for the young generation. You look at, Julia's been there, and he can tell you better. She can tell better than me. It's a sense of hopelessness in the West Bank, and just imagine in Gaza. The radicalizing so many people as a result. This can only spell bad news, not only for the Palestinians, but also for Israel. And the idea of peace and two states alone, yes, it's right morally. Yes, it was recognized by most countries. But I believe this is also in Israel's national interest to secure its long-term and security in relation to the Palestinians, but also acceptance within the region, possibly normalization with other countries in the region.
Well, moving along only somewhat, Italy's government has also ruled out recognising Palestine, but one arguably influential Italian institution has made its move. The Italian Football Coaches Association, or AIAC, wants Israel ejected from international competition. It is just about possible that the Italians are acting somewhat opportunistically. The two countries are in the same qualifying group for the 2026 World Cup, and as of this broadcast, Israel are ahead of Italy, who admittedly have a game in hand. The two countries are next scheduled to play each other on September 8th on neutral turf in Hungary. Julie, the obvious comparison being made here is with Russia, who have been suspended from competition since 2022, although even after they first invaded Ukraine in 2014, everybody still went to a World Cup in Russia. If that is the standard, however, well, the big question, should Israel be bounced?
Yeah, I would say, and this isn't a new question also. These appeals have been being made to FIFA for the last year, actually. They've kind of just decided to punt and kind of not make a decision on it. And I would say I think you can kind of see this both ways. On the one hand, countries I think feel like they want to again take some kind of moral stand here. They don't want to kind of to recognize the state of Israel and in these kind of sporting competitions. At the same time, I think there's others who feel like there needs to be a differentiation between sports and politics, or a sense that do players and athletes necessarily stand for their state, or is this kind of what representing what their state is doing? And I think that's always been a very tough call. I think one thing that FIFA wrestles with is when do you do this and when do you not? And I think the fact that it was done with Russia puts extra pressure on now to do it for Israel. But it does raise the question of when is it not done then for other states? And so it will push FIFA into a very difficult, I think, question as to when to use the boycott or not, because it's been pretty infrequent in history. I think they did it with South Africa. They've done it with Russia, and I think maybe one other time. But it's been very infrequently used. And I think it's going to be very difficult for FIFA to make the ban, but other countries may choose to take some kind of stance in this next World Cup.
Well, I mean, yeah, you can see, Yossi, the potential political nightmares opening up if individual players refuse to turn out against Israel or entire squads refuse to turn out against Israel. And should any of that happen, you can imagine what Israel's response will be. They'll say, well, should Palestine not be suspended as well? It was, of course, an arm of Palestine's government that launched the attack of October 7th, 2023.
I was tempted to say that you look at the history of football in Italy and Israel, the Italians are really shaking to play against Israel, especially in a neutral ground in Hungary. But I probably this is not the case. I'm torn about it. Instinctively, I'm against mixing politics and sport. I think,
except that sport is always political.
But then, yes, because otherwise you don't have national teams playing one against the other. So there is an inherent...
Everybody just kicks the ball amiably around the park for 90 minutes and says, that was fun.
Which is not. I mean,
but that's not compelling viewing, Yossi.
No, I agree. So there is, it's very partisan. It's after watching yesterday Liverpool, Newcastle, and you see how partisan it can become. Now, on that, so yes, there is a case. So when a country is so intransigent for 22 months, and you try to say, what's going to help? How we can do something and help in order to stop what we see in Gaza, eventually you resort to whatever in your own sphere of influence or occupation. If I'll do that, maybe it will help to stop the war. And obviously Israel will cry anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. The only thing I will say about not Palestine, the Palestinian team doesn't represent Hamas. It represents the PA and more the West Bank. So you can say that this was called by Hamas and not the Palestinians. Maybe I'm stretching it a little bit, but you can make this argument with the Israeli team represent the Israel. Again, I would like really to see that as a last resort and not to get too involved. In the article that we saw, the idea that, for instance, using the proceedings from the game to help to help humanitarian aid in Gaza, I think it might be a kind of very strong statement. We don't want to benefit, to make any financial gain out of this game with Israel. We are going to help the people of Palestine or people of Gaza. So maybe at least for now might be a better
Because there is, and you touched on this, Julie, the where do you stop argument, and at this point one can only imagine the unbelievable size of relief which must have echoed around the European Broadcasting Union earlier this year when Israel just failed to win the Eurovision Song Contest and therefore the right to host next year's. Because looking through the countries which are in play for the World Cup, Iran has already qualified, and also theoretically in the mix are North Korea, Sudan and Venezuela. Mm-hmm. So if you start throwing out country A for acting in an obnoxious manner, are you then obliged to start throwing out country B, C, D, E and so on?
Exactly. No, I think that's why this has become very difficult for anyone to make the call on. And again, I think without the recent precedent of Russia, I think this probably would not be as big of a consideration right now. But because that has happened, that's still extending into the current World Cup. It's raised a lot of traction, I think, for this case regarding Israel. That, as well as I think a lot of Palestinian solidarity, often modeling itself on South Africa solidarity, and this was done then. But I do think it makes it really difficult, especially for the World Cup, more than Euros or something within Europe, because it does open up a whole world of questions, and one that FIFA doesn't want to be the arbitrator for years on end, of almost having like a mini court of justice within them to kind of decide who's in and who's out and who's right or wrong. And so I agree with Yossi. I think this is, individual countries, individual teams may find other kind of workarounds to show some kind of expression of solidarity with Gaza that doesn't include the full boycott of Israel from the World Cup. But this is going to be tense. There's going to be a lot of, I think, pressure going into 2026 around this. And already we see just the matches themselves, very, very tense, a lot of extra security at them. And I think it's going to be difficult for both teams involved in these matches. And that's just the reality.
But in some countries, it's so poor. If you go to, for instance, former Balkans, almost go to a game in Croatia, the kind of banners politically everywhere. So it's...
Well, let's move along to a development, or at least a sentiment, with which no decent citizen could disagree. Transport for London is to launch a poster campaign asking passengers consuming audio content to wear headphones. It remains, however, an open question as to whether such polite reminders will register with the class of pestilential peasant who chooses to subject others to their racket, and whether it might be preferable for TfL to make some effort to enforce extant laws against playing music on the tube, ideally with batons and tasers. Julie, is a poster going to make any difference to this variety of obdurate troglodyte?
I'm sensing where you stand on this, Andrew. I also know
about it.
We all have headphones on in the studio. I'm just saying we're modeling well.
I have exceedingly Old Testament views.
I mean, I will say, I'm glad they're not policing this or something, but I will say,
why are you glad they're not policing it? That's exactly what they should be doing.
I mean, I wouldn't be opposed. Yossi and I were talking about this before. The headphones off drives me crazy on the tube. Not the music so much as when it's videos and kind of that stuff. And so I'm fully in favor of the headphone campaign, but I think they're smart to do it with the happy poster campaign first instead of making people feel penalized for not. And it may go down that route, Andrew. I'm not saying it won't, but they have to start somewhere with the positive energy.
No, I think, Yossi, on such confined spaces as tubes, tasers will do the job. on intercity trains, I do favour them being picked up and thrown out of the windows. And I'm not talking about any namby-pamby stopping the train first. I mean, out they go.
Yeah. So you're in favour of North Korean approach to discipline
on this
education.
Specific thing, because I've said it from this place before. There is a basic rule to being on public transport, and I would argue a basic rule to being a citizen, which is that if anybody else notices anything you are doing, you are probably being a jerk.
And to be honest, people don't smoke on the underpass.
They have started vaping.
I haven't seen it yet, but probably. Yeah. So certain things, yes, there is this law that can prevent them of doing. You're not allowed to drink on the tube.
People do that,
especially on Friday and Saturday night. but I think it's really irritating. And, probably it shows sometimes our age when we start talking, all these young people with all this music.
It's not just young people.
But it's not only, exactly, it's not only young people. And it's irritating, and it's not respecting other people's space. It's not and today headphones are not that expensive. They are more and more affordable. Just get ones, and I think it's part of how we learn in society, how to respect each other's privacy.
Unless it's Monocle, then I'd say blast it, turn it up.
No, not even Monocle. and it is not just young people, because, Julie, I did want to ask if either of you were ever interveners in such situations, because I am. And one such incident was a man comfortably in his 50s in a restaurant, watching a TV programme with the audio up. And I asked him, mate, could you please turn that off? He actually replied, I was here first. to which I responded, mate, how old are you?
And he said...
he did actually shut up after that.
I thought intervention might be a tackle there or something, Andrew. I'm surprised you asked so politely.
I was surprisingly... I may have been with other people.
No... No, I will say age doesn't have anything to do with it. I will say that, and because I think students and young people often get the bad rap for this, but no, it's all around. But it's just I'm the same. It's like common courtesy. This is not an age thing. Just put your headphones on. This is not hard.
I will just close on this by saying in 2023, a TFL employee called Razvan Lazar, and Mr. Lazar, if you're listening, you are a hero, did actually enforce the extant laws against one idiot with a Bluetooth speaker. He was fined 300 quid.
All right.
There should be a statue of Razvan Lazar somewhere. He is who they should have named one of the new overground lines.
Exactly.
After.
In Andrew's book, next to Mandela, a statue.
Yeah, pretty much the same thing. And on that upbeat note, Julie Norman and Yossi Mekelberg, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, it is often unwise to lapse into nostalgia about the politicians of yesteryear. They were often just as hapless, reckless, venal and or drunk as today's, but we are more comfortable reflecting on the history they steered as we know how it turned out. Where the current US administration is concerned, however, such comparisons are a difficult temptation to rise above. Among those appointed to the role of National Security Advisor by the current president, for example, are a swivel-eyed conspiracy theorist, a neocon headbanger who even Trump himself has turned the FBI on, and someone who inadvertently leaked war plans to a reporter, none of whom stand much comparison to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was President Jimmy Carter's NSA throughout Carter's entire term, an enduringly influential diplomat and the subject of a new book, Zbig, by Edward Luce. I spoke to Edward earlier and began by asking what he hoped to discover about his subject that we didn't already know or understand.
His great rival, Henry Kissinger, which is a massive theme, that relationship between these two great Cold War strategists. Kissinger's had many biographies, and he's cooperated with them, and he's had 4,000 pages or so of autobiography, 3 massive volumes. Brzezinski didn't really cooperate with biographers, and therefore there is a good one by a French intellectual translated in English called Justin Vez. He's a very good intellectual biography of Brzezinski's life, but nobody had written a full life biography, and it's so cinematic from, interbellum Warsaw in the 1920s to 2017, a few months into Trump's presidency. The span of his life and what happened during it is just an extraordinary story.
It is exactly that. I mean, his childhood alone, born in Warsaw in 1928, but his father's a Polish diplomat in Germany, so he sees the rise of the Nazis. His father is stationed in Moscow during Stalin's purges. I mean, seeing that sort of thing up close would obviously affect anybody, but to what extent did those really formative experiences colour his view of diplomacy in later life?
Well, he crossed the Atlantic. His dad was a Polish diplomat in 1938, shortly after Munich, the notorious Munich conference. And he brought with him, because his country was basically snuffed out the following year with the Nazi Soviet sort of pincer invasion of Poland that began the Second World War. He brought with him a burning sort of sense of wounded Polishness. And that for sure, helped drive him in the early stages of his life. He became a Sovietologist at Harvard, a very sort of rapidly ascending expert and Russian-speaking Sovietologist. idealist. And in his early years, the sort of Polish sense of needing to restore justice to the world and restore Poland's independence as a nation was strong. But he first went back to Poland in 1957 as a Harvard scholar. And it was at that moment that he realized he was American or Polish American. It had changed so much. He described the lifelessness in people's eyes, the sort of deadness of their expressions. And he felt American because he was very much a kinetic, quite active doer. And in that respect, even though he sounded Polish all his life, in that respect, he was very American.
I mean, the United States obviously embraced him. He ends up being National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter. And extraordinarily, I didn't realize this before reading it in the book, Ronald Reagan considered keeping him on, having him serve a Republican administration as well. Did you get a sense of what American foreign policy types from both sides of the aisle saw in Brzezinski?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the span of his interaction with American presidents goes from John F. Kennedy in the late 50s when he was preparing to run, right up to Obama, who he endorsed at a really critical moment in Obama's primary fight with Hillary Clinton. And those two presidents, Obama and JFK, his two favorite, other than Jimmy Carter. But, he wasn't actually a sort of hardcore Democrat. He endorsed Bush Sr., for example. He and Kissinger strangely found themselves for once on the same side, endorsing Bush Sr. in 1988. He voted for Nixon against McGovern. The disastrous McGovern campaign in 1972. He was neither a hawk nor a dove. He refused to take labels that are so beloved of foreign policy people like realist or idealist. He just did not belong to any sort of clear camp or group or school. He was a very, very independent thinker. And that does sort of cut against the grain in how Washington operates. So he made a lot of enemies. He had very sharp elbows.
What was he like, though? Because I do think this is a real measure of somebody in a position of power, and nobody in positions of power, as long as he was, gets it right every time. What was he like when things went wrong, specifically things that were his responsibility and as a consequence of his decisions or his advice?
So I think the biggest thing that went wrong when he was National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter was the Iranian hostage. And he, for sure, bears a big part of the responsibility for that. He basically bullied Carter to accepting the Shah of Iran, the exiled Shah of Iran, into the United States for treating his lymphoma. And that then triggered Iranian paranoia, quite understandable given Anglo-American coups in that country, including the 1953 one to put the Shah back on the throne. They thought the same thing was going to happen again. He should have said the Shah must be admitted on condition he renounce the peacock throne. Then maybe that wouldn't have been triggered. And he then, got involved in this harebrained hostage rescue, which sort of came to naught, rather tragic naught, at Desert One in the Iranian desert. And under pressure, he wanted to go back again. I mean, his son, Ian Brzezinski, mentioned he only saw his dad's face turn grey twice in his life. Once was then, the morning after the failed hostage rescue attempt, and the other time was when he was dying. So he was deeply, deeply sort of stricken by what had happened, which did lead to at least contribute to Carter's defeat to Ronald Reagan later that year. But he wasn't paralyzed by it at all. He wanted to find another way to get the hostages out.
And just finally, and I'm wondering if this was part of the appeal of doing the book as well, does he seem to you now like a figure from another age? It's hard to think now that we have any sort of, eminent foreign policy sages of that stature, for better or for worse, because, again, they're not right every time. He wasn't, and very certainly Kissinger wasn't, but it's not really a role that seems to be available anymore.
It's a very good question. I mean, regardless of what you think of Kissinger's record or Brzezinski's or George Kennan, who I'd sort of put up there, those three would be the great strategists. They were giants compared to the sort of slightly more careerist, slightly more groupthinky, what was rather derisively called the blob a few years ago amongst Washington foreign policy types. it's much more of a risk-averse, anti-entrepreneurial role nowadays. And you saw, it's not just a point about Trump. Marco Rubio will just never stand up to Trump. He's there because he's a loyalist. Brzezinski, Kissinger, Kennan, all these people had knockdown fights with their presidents and would sometimes win those fights. It's a question also of who they were. And I think in Kissinger and Brzezinski's case, the fact that they were emigrants from the bloodlands of interwar Europe, that they understood the tragic, made them quite un-American. They didn't subscribe to American exceptionalism, the idea that America is somehow suspended from the laws of history. They were quite gritty realists, and that involved stuff that, particularly with Kissinger, people found distasteful. But I cannot think of names today on either side of the aisle who would really compare to their stature.
That was Edward Luce speaking to me earlier. Edward's new book, Zbig, The Life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Cold War Prophet, is available now. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Julie Normand and Yossi Mekelberg. Today's show was produced by Hassan Anderson and researched by Henry King. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.